Today is the 10th of February, 2011. We are at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York. My name is Wayne Clark. Sir, for the record, would you please state your name and date and place of birth, please?
And my name is Richard Duvall, no middle initial. My date of birth is July 20th, 1929. I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
Did you attend school in Brooklyn?
I attended school in Long Island and East Rockaway for a while, and Oceanside, and then went to Garden City High School for matriculate for the last 4 years of school. And graduated from Garden City High School in 1945.
And I understand at that point you went into the Merchant Marine?
I went almost immediately into the Merchant Marine as soon as I reached my 16th birthday.
Now what made you decide on the Merchant Marine?
Because everyone in my high school, all the boys in my high school were all in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge, somewhere else, and there was a patriotic fervor among all young males about World War II. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was just a tsunami, a word that was not known then, but a tsunami of emotions among all kids. They all, you know, we all wanted to be part of what was going on with Hitler and Tojo. Mm-hmm.
Let me just go back a little bit. Do you recall where you were when you heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I know exactly where I was. I was in the living room listening to a professional football game which was being played in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. We used to have a professional football team there. I was with my dad. It was about 1 p.m., 1:30 in the afternoon on Sunday, December 7th. And I still have the exact console radio that my dad and I were listening to.
Really?
I have that radio at home. It's something that somehow the family hung on to. It's an AM shortwave radio, and it still plays, and it's a good conversation piece today because I can tell people I got the news of Pearl Harbor on that particular radio.
It's interesting. Did you find that your life changed after that?
After the
once we declared that we were at war.
I think everybody's life changed. Things happened. We got ration stickers for gasoline, 3 gallons of gas a week. We got involved. My father, who had been a lieutenant in the World War I in the trenches, became an air raid warden in Garden City. We had things like blackouts. There was a prisoner camp built less than a mile from my house from prisoners, German prisoners taken in the African campaigns under Rommel. They were brought to America, and when the fighting got serious in Europe and particularly in Sicily and Italy, a lot of the wounded were brought from those places to America, and the first place they were landed was Mitchell Field, Long Island, which was right next to the original home of the Rainbow Division, which was on Camp Mills, right in Garden City. We lived right there. There was an actual base, and there was that immediately after the war, we went into the war, the Air Force took the old Camp Mills thing and set up tents, and it was a reception area for new inductees into the Air Force before they were shipped to South for their pilot training and bombardier training and stuff like that. And the actual base of Mitchell Field was filled with aircraft, and we saw planes starting with Curtiss P-40s, which were coming in, and then when the P-40s went out, the P-38s came in, and then the Thunderbolts, the P-47s, and we watched all of this happen before our eyes. Plus, that field was a jumping-off base, starting-off base for the 8th Air Force, who was sending V-17s. And we saw hundreds of these planes. It was day and night. Relatives would ask us from other places, how can you sleep at night? We didn't hear the aircraft anymore. And B-24s were really the last big planes that we saw, the Liberator. And that was probably the latest bomber. But we did see also the A-26s, the B-25s that Doolittle flew over Tokyo. They all came through Mitchell Field. So we're very, very much aware and life did change for us. You know, we knew about rationing, we knew about you couldn't get sugar, you couldn't get nylon stockings and all that kind of stuff, so, you know. But we did take a family from England of children to live with us to escape the bombing, and we had them live with us till the end of the war. So.
And you actually went into the Merchant Marine before the war had ended?
Before the war ended, I shipped out of New York Harbor on my 16th birthday on a ship called the Esso New Orleans, and it was a T2 tanker, which was built in the shipyards down in Bethlehem, Maryland, and it was part of a large fleet of what then was the #1 tanker for oil, and our program was to go to Aruba, where the Dutch Shell had large refineries, and they were doing refining there, and it was our job to pick up, in some cases, excuse me, crude at Aruba or in Venezuela, and bring it back to refineries in New Jersey, or in some cases, in fact, when the war actually ended, I was in the Pacific, we were taking refined aviation fuel out to hook up with Navy tankers, and we were going to transfer from our ship to a Navy ship so that they could take it further. They were building up for the attack on Japan. By the end of the European War, all effort was going there, and the most incredible thing happened in my young life at that point. In order to get through the Panama Canal, going from east to west towards the Pacific, our ship had to wait in the holding bay 14 days before we could get passage through the canal. I think it was almost unheard of. I never saw so many ships. Of course, by the time when I went on that tanker, I'd never seen a ship in my life. I just got on the ship and went to work, and was handed a paintbrush and a chipping hammer.
Now, was your ship armed at all?
Yes, we had armaments on the ship, which were put on before I got on board. And we had a 3-inch gun forward, and we had a 5-inch gun aft. These were in gun tubs, which were built up on superstructures over. In fact, I used to stand watch. When it rained, I would get under the gun tub so I wouldn't get wet when doing bow watch. But those were put on, and some of the tankers, not all of them, carry a small complement of Navy crew who were the gunners on the ships. Were
they members of what they call the armed guard?
They were the armed guard. My status was I was a civilian working for Standard Oil. I worked for Esso. In fact, I had to join a union, Esso Tankermen's Association, the ETA. I had to join that in order to go on the ship. It cost about $3 to be a member. But being in the Merchant Marine was a great life. I was times contemplating spending the rest of my life on the ocean, but I had parents who had other ideas about that. They wanted their little boy to go to school someday. So,
now you mentioned chipping paint. Is that what they had you doing initially? When you go
on a ship and you're 16 years old, you're the lowest rank of the low, and you're an OS, ordinary seaman. And there's usually three ordinary seamen, one for each watch, and then you go to able-bodied seamen. That was far in the distant future in my life at that point. So you got to do all the rust chipping and painting and stuff like that needed to be done. But I did learn a lot of things. I learned splicing. I learned some basic navigation. And one of my most important jobs aboard that ship was making coffee every night for the men in the up in the tower above the midships who steered the ship, the mates. And the ordinary seaman proved to be a very valuable guy, because if the mates didn't get their coffee, probably they would have turned the ship around and gone home.
Now, what was the food like aboard ship?
Food was absolutely, and after being through the limited stuff in the grocery stores in World War II, the food was fantastic. They had the best possible food in the world.
Mhm.
And the pay was magnificent. It was $87 a month. But you got a roof over your head and you got the best meals.
Mhm. Did you ever get seasick at all?
No, I watched the other young guys coming on board ship at different ports, and they get seasick as hell.
Mhm.
We always felt sorry for those guys, you know. But they would get off the ship the next time they came into a port on that coast. You could not disembark on a different coast. You couldn't get on in the East Coast and get off in the
I
Gulf.
see.
They didn't want people to use ships as you know, transportation to another part of the world. But you could, like I got on a ship once in Boston, got off in Baltimore. It was not a problem.
Mhm. Now, when you were in the Pacific, were you ever under attack by the Japanese?
No,
at all?
we were really just a couple hundred miles outside the Panama Canal. And it probably would have been a freakish thing and totally unexpected if Japanese submarines had come that far.
Mhm.
I doubt that they would have done that. There was a dreadful sinking just prior to that. And when our ship that carried Little Boy, after Truman gave the order to bomb,
Mhm.
that atomic bomb was placed in a wood box aboard the Indianapolis, which is our newest, fastest cruiser, and it was taken to Okinawa and offloaded, and then that ship was ordered to go south towards Australia, and it was there happened to be a Japanese submarine just waiting to come through, and this busy channel where American ships went through, and they thought the speed of the ship might, you know, have them avoid it, but he nailed that ship, and the men was a huge loss of life.
Mhm.
It was our last major loss in World War II, the sinking of the Indianapolis. So,
Do you recall where you were when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt? I think that happened in April of 45.
April of 45, I was probably still in high school.
Okay.
And we knew he'd been very ill, and it was not a surprise to our family, but it didn't really have an impact
Mhm.
in any way of, well, we were really more curious than anything else to see what the vice president was going to be like,
Mhm.
Harry S. Truman.
Now, when the Japanese, were bombed with the atomic bomb and they surrendered, what was it like aboard ship? Was there a lot of celebration?
No, there wasn't celebration, but it was a curious event. We were sailing in our tanker because we were fully loaded. We were sailing with wartime restriction on lights and communications and everything else. And I can remember standing bow watch, and when you're a seaman on watch, you have to report other lights that you see ahead. So in case the mates and the people up in the top deck who are steering the ship, in case they're poring over papers or taking a nap or something like that, they hear that bell, they know they got to run up to the lookout and see what's ahead. And I rang up one ring for a light that was way over on port side, off the port. I went back 10 minutes later. I went back and rang on. The light again was way over in the starboard.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 minutes later, it was straight ahead of us, dead ahead. So I rang up, ding, and then ding, ding, and then ding, 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 for straight ahead. Well, what it was, they had gotten word that the war was over, and they had all their lights on, and they were all fried to the eyeballs, all drunk, aboard the ship. So when they passed us, at some point going in the other direction, they communicated and told us, and then the captain put our lights back on for us. So that's how we found out.
Mm-hmm.
And we got back to the Cologne, or the city that's on the west coast of Panama. We pulled into port there and went ashore quickly, and we saw all the newspapers and printed, in the paper about the bomb and everything else. And I was able to. I knew Spanish, so I could translate for my fellow crew members
Mm-hmm.
what we had just seen and heard. And the war was over.
How long did you stay in the Merchant
I
Marine?
stayed in the Merchant Marine until I was told by the chief mate, Charles O'Hara, who was an admirable, very fine sailor, and a credit to the American Merchant Marine. He was a man whose mother was Chinese and his father was an Irishman. He could have been a movie star if he wanted to be. I was called up to a top deck and where the steering wheel of the ship was one night, and he said to me, he addressed me as Seaman. He said, "Did you go to high school yet?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Oh, well, you're leaving this ship. The next stop on the Baltimore. You're off the ship." And I couldn't imagine what I had done wrong. But then he smiled. He said, "You're going to school. Our home office got a message from your father. They want you home in 10 days. So I got off at Baltimore. I caught a train to New York City, and then trained to Garden City and went home.
Mm-hmm.
And then, a week later, I was at Colgate University.
Now, what was your homecoming like? Basically, you were in the Merchant Marine, but you were coming home as a veteran.
It was not it was just very normal. "Oh, you're home, Richard.
Uh-huh.
Okay, what do you want for breakfast?" I mean, it was not. They weren't celebratory about it.
Well, I'm sure they were glad to see you.
Mom was very, very glad.
Mm-hmm.
My sisters had a few questions, and my brother was a little boy, about 7 or 8 years older. Well, from 1945, he went home at 10 or 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So he saw his big brother come home. So, but it was very interesting at that time. When I got up to Colgate, I was entered in. They had a trimester program at Colgate at that time, but they were on a wartime schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So my freshman class had 96 males. It was an all-male school at that time. The average age of the freshmen in that class of 96 was 24 years old. So I think there were 4 of us who were, recently out of high school, and all the rest of them were guys who were coming back from either Europe or Philippines or Japan. I mean, one of my roommates had been captured by the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge and been held prisoner. And he was a boy from Albany. His name is Harold May Sporberg. His family owned Sporberg Millinery in Albany before the war. And Sonny Sporberg was a champion hockey player. He probably weighed 190 pounds when he was a defenseman. He weighed 120 pounds in Regensburg, Germany, when Patton's army finally caught up with him. He had been captured in the Bulge, and because his last name was Sporberg, the Germans had him down as Jewish, and which he was, and they had his dog tags, and they weren't going to do anything bad to him, but they assigned him to 3 walking wounded who were German soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
and he was to be their valet, and they were ordered to go the other direction towards Russia in 44 when the Bulge happened. And he was beaten every night by 2 of the German soldiers. And the 3rd guy used to stay awake and take part of his ration and give it to Sonny, Harold May Sporberg, and keep him alive. And when the Americans finally caught up with his ragtag group, and Sonny was able to identify them, he was not one of the Germans,
Mm-hmm.
the sergeant embraced him and said, "Hey, kid, is there anything we can do for you?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you have a BAR here?" And the guy says, "Yeah, we can get you a BAR. What do you want?" He said, "Well, tell that guy go over there and stand over there and leave those 2 guys there." And this 19-year-old kid cut him in half,
Mm-hmm.
2 guys. Just cut him right in half. Boom, end of story. But he was my roommate for a couple of years. I've spoken to him a couple of years ago. He's forgotten about all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Put it out of his mind. But
Now, did you have any sort of veteran status as far as like the GI Bill? Did you receive any sort of compensation for your college
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. There was nothing. There was nothing built into the situation at all. The commander of the Merchant Marine in those years was a man named Emery Land, and he was outside the, this I don't know whether he was Coast Guard or not. I kind of doubt it. I think it was just an American Merchant Marine, which had been fairly large prior to World War II. But we lost so many ships. We lost hundreds and hundreds of ships. So, I had nothing, and then of course, by the time I got through Colgate, June 25th, 1950, showed up on. Well, I was on Long Island Railroad one day. The New York Times said the Koreans were doing something over there, and I was going in looking for a job. I was a college graduate, and I came home that night, and I said I better go down and find out what's going on here. And a friend of my wife's family was the head of the draft board in Rockwell Center, Long Island, which was our draft board for where we were in Nassau County. So we called him, and he said, well, what did your husband do in the war? Was he in the Merchant Marine? He said, that doesn't count. He's going to be drafted. So he's 1A. So I had a talk with my family, my dad in particular. He'd been an officer in France, and he said, well, when you go in, son, we're going to do your best to, have you go in where you can go become an officer. And at that time, we did a little snooping around. It took a couple of months to dig it all out. But the U.S. Marine Corps had a program called the PLC program, Platoon Leader Class. And if you were had a college graduate, you had a bachelor's degree, you could go into the Marine Corps, enlist, and in 6 or 8 weeks, when you finished your training at either Paris Island or wherever, Quantico, wherever they wanted to train you, you would come out as a lieutenant. My father said, see, there you go. You can become an officer. So I went down and joined the U.S. Marine Corps Platoon Leaders Class. One of the famous people in television today, Jim Lehrer, he was part of that particular program at that time of year. And the people that they were cranking out in the Marine Corps with these gold bars, these are all the young platoon leaders that had one of the highest fatality rates in the Korean War. The snipers in Korea, they knew about the gold bar, and I heard later, years afterwards, that so many of them didn't come back. Well, the Marine Corps assigned me to, swore me in. I was a technical Marine on paper, but I had to come back for a Navy physical, and the Navy doctors a week later found a damaged bone in one of my arms. They said, well, you cannot ever become an officer in the Marine Corps. You have a history of bone damage. You can stay in the Marine Corps as an enlisted man, and right away my father's directions were popped into my head. Or you can, get a discharge from the Marine Corps and go back to your former status, whatever that may be. I protested this. My young wife and I drove to the Pentagon. We asked for a meeting with the Navy board, spent 2 or 3 hours at a Navy board. I had letters from doctors, I had letters from coaches, I had letters from my boxing team members, my lacrosse team. I'm fit, I can do this, I can handle it. You know how a kid is, I can take the world on. I was ready to take the world. And a couple of months later, I got a letter from a Marine Corps major. Sorry, buddy, you're out of here. So I ended up going into the draft pool in Hempstead, Long Island, and taken over to Kilmer. And then on troop train to Camp Gordon, which is now Fort Gordon, in Georgia. Signal. And we're going to send you to MOS 4805 school, which is cryptography. And we're going to teach you how to send messages in code. But before you do that, before we're going to teach you that, we're going to teach you how to type. Because we need you to be a typist if you're going in the Signal Corps. Well, I've never been able to tell one finger or another finger to do this or to that. And I went through the typing program 3 times, and the instructors in the school said, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to have you teach the course. So they put me into teaching advanced military cryptography, and I was able to tell people about time zones and what type of equipment to use and how to encode and decode with. They had some very sophisticated, it wasn't just the M209, we had very sophisticated equipment it automatically made 5-letter code groups out of language. And when that all finished, they had a draft come down. I was teaching for about 6 weeks and really enjoying the work. There were good kids in the class, there were good teachers, it was a lot of fun, but the Chinese were coming in Korea, and they did a sweep right through every base in America. We want every man jack out on a ship to Oakland. So I was given 3 days off and flown to a ticket, went to LaGuardia Airport, said goodbye to my wife, got on a troop ship, and 18 days later I was in Camp Drake, Yokohama, and I have a story to tell about Yokohama and Camp Drake. It is a made-up story. It's not true, but I tell it to my grandsons with an attachment to the story. At the end of the story, I tell them, this is from Papa's imagination. You can have a laugh at it, because they asked me why I never got to Korea. And I tell them that, well, when I saw that everybody was going to Korea with a gun, I went to the colonel and told him, you know what, you and I ought to stay here and help protect Japan. So the colonels, and I tell this to my grandsons, and they grin now. They're in their 30s now, so they're used to this kind of stuff from the old man. But what was happening, actually, there was a threat from North Korea to northern Japan, and Signal Corps was given the responsibility to form a radio net around Honshu Island and Hokkaido. And Hokkaido was the northernmost point. And they needed signal people to do that. They needed people who were on deuce and a halves and Angry 9, the radio huts. And we went to a base in outside of Sendai, Japan, which is the 8th largest city. It had been heavily bombed by B-29s. You could go up to the top of the hill in our camp where we used to pull guard duty and look down and see the pattern of bombing where the so-called B-29s used to come in every night, and the Japanese would tell us about it. You know, but no animosity. But of course a lot of people who had that bad feelings against Americans, you never spoke to them. I mean, they wouldn't come near you. But we ended up building a radio network around northern Japan in Hokkaido, and my job, I was taken out of cryptography and I was made acting motor sergeant, because I was really the only guy who knew how to change a tire on a truck, and that was my qualification. The Army gave us a field of World War II deuce and a halves that had been left there to rot. And of course the tires were the first thing to go, so they said, you pick 4 or 5 guys and get this thing running. And they gave us a liaison with the 24th Infantry Division, which had just come out of Korea, and they were based at a camp called Schimmelfenning. In German means shiny penny. Schimmelfenning was in Sendai, Japan, and because they made me acting sergeant so I could deal with sergeants in quartermaster at Schimmelfenning, and I was able to go there with our little Dodge weapons carriers and pick up a tire every other day or pick up a battery. And we got all the trucks running, and we got the PE-75s, which are the power units for the Angry radios, the Angry 9 radios, the huts, and we had to send 50 of those, loaded them on Japanese trains, and the loading took about 2 weeks, but we did what they call circus-type loading from the side, and we had no crane equipment, and Schimmelfenning didn't have the crane equipment, so we took 2 of our telephone pole trucks and put them together, and we were able to pick up a hut, and the guy would drive out, and we'd drop the hut onto the train, and then he would back and put his empty deuce and a half on the train. We'd tie everything down, and the train would pull up, and we'd do the next one. And we did this for 2 weeks till we had a circle of radio warning nets, and all of our personnel were coming in from signal schools to handle radios. They were distributed all over Hokkaido to be part of the early warning net in case the Koreans came down with MiGs or something else to bomb Japan. There was a threat there. And this was all under MacArthur, 16th Corps headquarters. And that was the life there. The food was great in Japan.
Did you get into Korea at all? Or?
No, I would.
No?
But what was very strange to me, I was a young married man, and half the guys, or more than half the guys in the outfit, radio operators and everything else, we all had young wives and everything else at home. And I had been a student of graphology, which is reading handwriting. And guys would take a paragraph of their wife's letter, nothing personal, and just give me stuff that I could, read the handwriting. It was amateurish, but it was more than what they had and they'd ever heard about. And I was able, and they say, my God, you got, and this is no compliment to me, I just had a good teacher for graphology. And this was how we used to pass our time. But these guys, after, we were sitting in this camp, building this, radio stations and everything else to be shipped north, these guys would get restless. These are men with young wives at home. They didn't go in 3 at a time, 2 at a time to the commanding officer, ask for transfers to Korea. And you know who the Koreans were picking off the quickest? The guys who were on the poles, the linemen, the guys who were stringing the wires, because that was the main kind of communication from north to Busan all the way down south were the telephone poles along the railroads. And we would get letters back from guys who were over there that so-and-so got killed yesterday, snipers. And they would just go, it has to be put to death. Well, it was very strange to us.
What did you do during your time off over there?
I met a guy, his name is Raymond Rice. Raymond was from St. Louis. Raymond Rice was a teacher, a high school teacher of French. He spoke French fluently, and he carried around, with his duffel bag and everything else, he carried out a violin case. He also played the violin. Now, Raymond Rice was not your typical Rambo soldier. He was probably 5'8", overweight, about 30 pounds or something like that. But he had the sweetest disposition in the world, and he loved his violin, and he could speak French. And when he came over on a troop ship several months before I did, he contracted hepatitis. And when the Army got him into Drake, he was suffering. And the only place that the U.S. Army at this point could give a man like that care, the French, who had been fighting in Vietnam before we did, at Dien Bien Phu, right? The only place that they could put a man, American soldier that was sick, that could be treated properly, was in a French-run hospital, where the nurses all were Japanese, but they all spoke French. So here's one little American soldier who's got a violin, who's a pudgy little guy, adorable like a little teddy bear, and he's put into this hospital for 6 weeks for hepatitis. Well, don't you know he learns to speak Japanese fluently with a French accent? Now, if that isn't an oddity to the Japanese, to have this little guy, and his last name was Rice, and rice in Japanese is Gohan, the word for rice. So he became Gohan-san, and Gohan-san and I would travel around Sendai at night, and he would take his violin, and he would go in and he'd play the violin in the beer joints. And I drank beer in those days. But somebody noticed Gohan-san and had him come over and invited him to the mayor's home. mayor of Sendai, very important man. And the mayor had two daughters, one played the piano and one played the violin. And one was studying French. So we were invited over to the mayor's house frequently to entertain. And this was a lot of fun. These were young teenage girls, and they absolutely were mesmerized by this chubby little guy who could speak French and Japanese. He spoke Japanese very well. So, other than that, there was not a whole lot to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's fairly isolated there where we were. It was a base that needed, we were out in the sticks somewhere. There was not much. There was no nightlife. There was no, bawdy places to go to. Nothing like that. You were out in the rice paddies.
What were your commanding officers like?
They were reservists who had been in World War II and were called back. Captain Smith was, he was there and he was doing his job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as high as I ever saw, was the captain. And we were a battalion, part of a battalion, but we were 8174th Signal Company.
Mm-hmm.
And I never saw anybody above that.
Now, what about your actual living quarters?
They were single floor barracks that were hurriedly made over into, just steel beds and blankets and stuff like that. But
Mm-hmm.
Community latrines. When you go in the morning, sit on the pot, and there's 5 other guys nose to nose with you, around. I mean, it wasn't bad. It was nothing. It was. I mean, whenever the weather was good, we were outdoors all the time playing football or something like that. We had those trucks to do,
Mm-hmm.
and the truck job was a great job. I had a lot of fun with the truck job, being motor sergeant. I had my own Jeep, and there ain't many E1s that went over there, had got their own Jeep to drive around.
Now, what rank were you when you were discharged? Were you?
I was a corporal. In the books, I was a corporal, acting sergeant,
Mm-hmm.
but that didn't. I came out of corporal.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the biggest moment in my life over there, when the first sergeant called everybody out early on in getting things ready with the trucks. He said, "How many of you people here?" And by this time we had a complement. We had about half a company can drive a truck, a 6-shift. I was the only one who put my hand up. And all the rest of the guys could probably drive truck, but they were smarter than I was. Or they had it figured out, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody told them, don't ever volunteer. So the captain came and the sergeant the next day, that acting sergeant Duvall, motor sergeant, is going to have a driving school. So I got a couple of guys, good buddies, to start the driving school. So we were teaching, ostensibly driving 2.5-ton trucks through the small streets of Sendai and North. We used to go way out of town. We'd load up with gasoline tanks and drive far in the countryside, find a beach and go, We made good use out of our deal as a driving school, but half the guys at our company all came from one town in Indiana. It was a town with a lot of Greeks. It was in southern Indiana. It was a Greek population. Because half my friends were named like Spiro Logothetis and stuff like that. And these guys were the best guys to be with. I mean, they were really, they could be in any GI picture anywhere, World War II, anywhere else. But during one of our driving things, there was some red lights flashing ahead. And we were going this way, and there was a convoy coming this way. And one of us had to give way. So after some discussion with one Japanese guy who knew a little bit of English, the convoy up there backed up, and we went through. And the other convoy coming down this way, southbound, was the Emperor of Japan in his car, and a contingent of people alongside. And he was out for a tour in the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
So the Emperor backed up for this handful of GIs. And we didn't know anything about it. We didn't go ha-ha or anything like that. We just said, okay, we saluted. And we were actually, most of us were going before we realized that this was, because I recognized him, I could see him. Because MacArthur kept him as part of the government after, when the thing was signed on the battleship Missouri. We never saw MacArthur. We never heard about anything about MacArthur. We never heard anything bad about what was going on there. It was, I would say, a fairly routine job. We could have been anywhere. We could have been in Iowa, you know, except for the Japanese. And a handful of us made an attempt, serious attempt, to learn a lot of the language. And of course, having Gohan-san with us, he was a big help.
Mm-hmm.
So I could still greet people in Japanese, and teach words in Japanese to grandsons and daughters and things like that. And occasionally I run into Americans who were there. I've looked up the 8174th on the internet. They have a website, but I haven't found anybody who was in that company when we were there. It must have come afterwards, because we formed the company. It was, you know, we were the guys who started the 8174th.
How much time did you spend?
Over a year in Japan. And then one day it was, I guess I was on the rotation, and I don't think I had a half hour to get my things together and get on a train, go to Tokyo, and then to Drake, and then a troop ship. And we came back. We went over on the General Rose, and we came back on something like the Bruckner. They were ATS, Army Transport Service vessels.
Mm-hmm.
There were probably 8,000 men on the ship. Our tour over was 18 days. Our ship back was 21 days. It had nothing to do with the currents or the wind or the engines or anything else. But on the forward deck on the troop ship, there were 4 large boxes with dogs in them. And they were the dogs that belonged to an American Army officer who had been in Japan, and he'd been transferred to Okinawa. So we had to take the colonel's dogs to Okinawa. So 8,000 men and a large ship, and the colonel's dogs went from Yokohama to Okinawa to drop off the dogs, and then we could go home. We went back to Oakland.
Were you discharged from Oakland?
No, I was discharged back to Kilmer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just bum, bum, bum. They weighed you out. They told you, you weigh 160 pounds. You put on any weight while you were here, so you don't owe us any money. It was just like, all right. So I was away for a while.
So you were discharged in 1953.
1953, May 53,
Mm-hmm.
and they were just getting us out as fast as they could. They wanted us off the payroll as quickly as possible. So, and then the only thing that I used that I got from the government after that was I was able to buy a house with a GI Bill.
Okay.
And my wife at that time had lost a miscarriage in Georgia when we were stationed. Actually, she came down while I was still, teaching in the school down there. She came down. She worked as a company clerk, as a typist,
Mm-hmm.
and that was not a great experience for her. But when we came home, we connected again, and she was going to have a baby, so we needed a little house. So next thing I needed was a job. So I got a job working in a department store for about less than $100 a week. But it was some money.
Mm-hmm.
In '53, it amounted to about $4,500 a year or something like that. But it was enough to get a bank loan, because the house we were buying was about $10,000 on Long Island, in a small village, which we knew, was familiar with the village. It was a nice place. And we had 3 more children after that. So 4 kids.
Now, did you, once you got out, did you join any veterans organizations, like the VFW or the Legion?
I gave it a great deal of thought,
Mm-hmm.
but first of all, it would have been going far away here to there. Geographically, it was undesirable, to get into something like that. And I was young and focused on career, and the Legion thing, I'm more of a city boy.
Mm-hmm.
It's really not for city kids. They got so many other things that grab their attention. I could see had I gone, maybe lived up north here, and it was a social organization like the Legion or VFW or something like that. I could see maybe I might have been inclined towards that. But I'm not a joiner.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think my brother is either. We're not. Neither of us are people who get into social type things.
Mm-hmm.
Not more than that. I had no animosity towards them. When they had the Congressional Medal on a parade, I was, the minute they said, want to put your car, come in and take the Congressional Medal, I jumped at it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud of it. I still have photographs of it. I still have cards from, Ernie Childers and
Mm-hmm.
the other guys, Hoke and all those guys who were, Medal of Honor guys. Absolutely, great stuff.
Did you stay in contact with any of the people you were in service with? Write letters back and forth or send Christmas cards?
I got a phone call from a guy named Valentine who was one of the best guys that I could have help me during the truck period. And when his call came in one night, my youngest son had just been killed, and I said, "Can I talk to you another time?" And I guess he took it wrong, and he never called me back. And I don't know where he is. It was a ghost thing. I suppose if I went on a search today with, looking for people, I could maybe find a couple of the guys. The only thing I've tried to do is get the 8174 Signal Company on the internet to see if there's an alumni thing there, and I haven't found any name that I recognize. I did. I went through a drinking period in my life when I would get home very late at night, like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and when I was working in New York City. This was long after the service life. I remember being sort of shaky on my feet, and I hailed a cab, and I got a cab. I got into the cab, and I looked at the guy. I said, "Hey, you're Nick Puglia from Japan." And he turned around and left. He was a cop and a part-time cab driver in New York City. And he was a cop at Fort Apache up in the Bronx. And we just said, "Hey, buddy, how you doing? How you doing?" That was my kid got me to Penn Station so I could get a train and go home. So I guess he didn't want to follow up a guy who was not too steady on his feet at the time. So I don't blame him.
How do you think your time in the service changed or affected your life?
Well, I think if you link the two times together, the Merchant Marine activity and the men that I was on the ships with, and I observe other people, both male and female, intently.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of my nature, to belong to the part of the human race that works hard and rolls up their sleeves. I felt the same way about the Army. I never knew anybody in the Army all the time I served with that I didn't like or didn't enjoy the company or have a good time with. And I got so much out of being with them. And the same thing was true on the ships. There's a kid on my ship named Al Scaramuzzo. I'll never forget him. He was an Italian kid, obviously, from Staten Island. And he was an able-bodied seaman. The first thing, when I got on this ship, he took me under his wing. And there was nothing funny about it. He said, "Look, I want to show you what to do here. I can still do splicing, rope splicing now. From those days, he taught me how to splice. He taught me how to steer a ship. They let me steer the ship up the Orinoco River in Venezuela. It wasn't the best move on the captain's part because halfway going out of the Orinoco, we had a ship full of monkeys because I steered the ship into trees, overhanging trees, so there were monkeys running all over the ship. But to answer your question seriously, I think all of this made me a better person. My parents made me a better person. My brothers and sisters may be a better person. But, and I will credit up there also the high school sports activity. I was very active in boxing. I was very active in lacrosse.
Mm-hmm.
These were aggressive sports, and people tell me I have an aggressive side to my nature that I got to keep under control. So I'm glad I wasn't put into combat. I probably would have done something stupid.
All right, let me ask you this. How did you end up in this part of the country?
Well, first of all, I like upstate New York. I went to school up here.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to school from 46 to 50. So I spent a lot of winters up in Hamilton, New York. And I like it up here. Whenever I bought a car, I would buy it from a friend of mine in Norwich, New York, which is not far from here. And always have an excuse to come up to this neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm.
When my children were little and my grandsons were little, part of the summer program was 2 weeks on a dairy farm somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And when my older kids were real little, we used to go to a dairy farm in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. And when that lady got too old, went to a dairy farm upstate in Vermont, in Rogers Farm. I can't think of the name of the town. But then we went to a dairy farm in Rochester, Vermont, which is about 100 miles from where I live now. All farms, all with the kids. It was a connection of the kids to the farms. You come on the farm, grandpa, daddy and mommy go teach you about cows and birthing and all this kind of stuff. And when we decided to move off Long Island because it was just getting claustrophobic,
Mm-hmm.
and, well, I guess anybody who knows Long Island knows what goes on. It's just a panic city down there on the roads and everything else. We said we want to go 200 miles to circle around New York, so we looked at Jersey, Virginia, up this way, Massachusetts, etc. And we've put a deposit on a house in near Rutland, Vermont, and the deal fell through. But the broker said, "Why don't you go over to Washington County in New York?" "Where's that?" "Never heard of it." Da, da, da. That led to settling in Easton, which is part of Washington
Mm-hmm.
County, and we ended up buying a small farm, which is not operating at the time, but we do lease land we grow corn and alfalfa for neighboring cows at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big farmer over there who does 700 acres of this kind of contract farming on other people's lands, and he supplies food for cows because it's part of the dairy system over there. So that's how we ended up here.
I see. All right. Now you brought some photographs along, and also with your application there was some photographs, and also I think there was a certificate here of you in the merchant marine, when you find it. Okay. Yeah, if you want to hold those up in front of you, and I can zoom in on them.
Okay. We'll take the merchant marine first, because that's really one of the top 10 highlights of my life. It's like for the merchant marine. But this shows you what they gave you, and it has the dates of July 20th, 1945, and everything else. And the U.S. Coast Guard certified seaman if you got a job with a company. So I went to Standard Oil and got a job with Standard Oil. And
All right. And those two cards up at the top, those are your...
They gave you, and this came as a total surprise to me, but Merchant Marine in Pacific War Zone and Atlantic War Zone, and this is perhaps totally technical, but if I wanted to, I could. I have them on a picture on the wall somewhere in the house.
Okay.
I think it becomes part of family history, that some future
sure.
generation will say, "Oh, look, there was an old geezer somewhere who did this kind of stuff." And the other picture I have is during the Korean War, which when the U.S. government started to get serious about me being a soldier, they sent me to Gordon, Camp Gordon in Georgia, a huge base.
Okay, now which one are you?
And I'm the better looking one of the two. The one over this
Oh,
way,
okay.
over here.
All right, and then the shot at the bottom.
This is in basic training. And the shot at the bottom is the day that I left my young life, and I had orders in my pocket to report to Oakland to go to the Far East. And what they did was they just cut orders for FECOM, which is Far East Command,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't know where you were going. You had no idea where you were going to end up, with whom, in what capacity, whether you're going to be a tank driver, whatever. They were just going to send you over. The Army was going to do what they felt like doing or what they had to do
Mm-hmm.
when you got there. So 8,000 of us went into Drake, off the ship, Camp Drake, which is known, they came from Europe, Repel-Deppel, replacement depot.
Mm-hmm.
And we went there, and it's a series of quadrangles, stretches for 10 football fields, these quadrangles. And 1/8 of the ship reported into that quadrangle, 8,000 men each morning. And you stood there and waited for your name to be called. And my name was never called. And the guy that went with me, Jack Davies, my cohort, his name was never called. So at the end, we came to the sergeant and said, well, it's time to go home now. What's the next ship back? And he said, no, we got a better idea. You're going to take the train from Tokyo to Sendai, and that's where you're going. But there was no, we didn't care. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was no response to that. Well, what are we going to do there? I mean, that was our question.
Yeah.
What for? What do you want? They're forming a new company, a signal company, for the tactical defense of Japan and for 16th Corps. So that was our nomenclature.
Okay, now there's
The last
ship
picture
picture.
here. This isn't the exact ship that I wanted, but it's the same ship because they were all identical. And this is a T2 tanker.
okay.
And it was probably, for a 60-year-old kid, a big highlight. To go on a ship. To get to the ship, I had to take a duffel bag of my clothes that my mommy helped me pack.
Mm-hmm.
And some LL Bean boots. I was a customer of LL Bean in 1945. Take the Long Island Railroad to New York City. Take the train all the way downtown to the Staten Island ferry. Take a nickel out of my pocket and pay the ferry to go across the other side of the harbor to Staten Island. And the little piece of paper about this much writing on the bottom of it said, take the first train on the right-hand side to the second stop, and you'll see an electric light bulb at the bottom of the stairway. Go down to that electric light bulb, and there's a string there, turn it on and off 5 times, and wait. And by this time, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm down there with my duffel bag, and a sandwich, half a sandwich, and ring the bell, and then I hear tugboat, little motorboat comes over. The guys would get in, and we go back across the harbor to New Jersey. This was where the ships, tankers, it was a tanker pier.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked up, and it was higher than this room, the top gunnels of that tanker. And he said, go over there's your gangway. And then we climb up there, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. There was a guy sitting up there waiting. Yeah, he was on duty as, a deckhand. He said, let me see what you got. I showed him, where, go back in there, there's a cabin back there, number 6, go in there. And that's where I lived. We went out of the harbor, and he said, you be at 7 o'clock the next morning, somebody will get you. Because I was on the 8 to 12 watch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you're the lowest, the 8 to 12 is you go on, because it's 5.5 day work day on a ship. And if you're 8 to 12, you work 6 days. You work the half day. And the guys on 12 to 4 and 4 to 8, they don't work. You know, they get the whole weekend off. So I had that, and then he said, you don't use terms like fall out, you just come above decks, below decks, it's ladders, aft 4 and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I knew all that stuff from camping. I knew ships and stuff like that. And the first guy I had to work for was a bosun, who I thought was the fiercest Viking I had ever seen in my life. He could not speak English, he spoke only Swedish, but he had a little bit English, and he told me to go get the even line. I didn't dare ask him, what's that? I was actually terrified. But that was to throw over to get the hawsers back and pull them up. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to go on the bow, because they needed a bow watch at daylight to go sail out of the harbor, even though they had a pilot there. They still had to have somebody forward, that's the regs. So I stood on the bow watch. And then my friend Scaramouza came up and told me, he said, I see you're up here all by yourself. Do you know about the bells? I said, no, what bells? He said, there's a bell right there. He said, you have to ring the half hour. 1 bell, 2 bells for 1:30, 3 bells for 2 o'clock or whatever it was, 1 o'clock, 4 bells for this. Remember, 8 bells is this and this and this. So you had to ring just to make sure you stay awake. So you're always ringing bells every 30 minutes when you're on watch. And then you report somebody, 1 bell here, 2 bells starboard, 3 bells forward, straight ahead, dead ahead. So I didn't even know what to do. But I found out very quickly.
Okay. Now, we just have a few seconds left. You want to show us that picture of your, whoops. We'll have to put in. Okay, now we have a shot here of your father in World War I.
Yes, indeed.
And he's the gentleman in the center.
He's in the center.
Now, when and where was this photograph taken?
This was taken on December 18th, which is a short time, 2 or 3 weeks after the armistice was signed in Paris at Versailles on November 11th, 1918. This is December 18th. This was taken in a small town in Clemency, France.
Mm-hmm.
And the 3 men, I presume, are members of his division, which was the 91st Pine Tree Infantry Division. Their symbol was a pine tree. He used to have, when I was a little boy, I saw his helmet in the house one day. It disappeared. People take those things, souvenirs. But it had a little pine tree on it. And I've tried to look it up. They had a good battle record, but he never spoke much about it. He had partial hearing loss from artillery during that war. We knew that, and or at least he attributes it to the war. He brought back a lot of maps and things like that were part of the archives, but he never paid much attention to it. And we probably, a total amount of time that he ever talked about his life in France in a war was probably 2 or 3 hours in a lifetime we spent with him. He lived to be 96 years old.
Wow.
His sister lived to 102. His brother lived 95. So, and he lived in Garden City his adult life. His boyhood was spent in Louisville, Kentucky. He spent some time briefly working in Chicago, and then he came to New York. So he essentially considered himself a New Yorker, and really never went back home. A very independent guy, and probably one of the most optimistic people I've ever known in my life. Everything was positive about this man. And so I think if either of us have any signs of optimism in our lives about how we do things, it came from not only him, but my mom was the same way. They always thought, we'd come out all right.
Now, how long did your mother live till?
He survived her. She had a serious stroke where she became aphasic in her late 70s, early 80s. So very fortunately, a senator in Connecticut, Lowell Weicker, was able to arrange for them a brand new nursing home that some of his friends had built, and they wanted a couple situation to show people what it's like for a couple to retire together and be in nursing together. And they both lived in the same room till the end of their lives, which was a nice thing for him. I know he cared so much for her.
And what was your mother's name?
Mildred Louise McKeon. Her grandfather was born in Ireland. Her father was, I think he was born in Ireland too. But they emigrated, the Irish part of her family emigrated to Liverpool during the famines in Ireland, and then they immigrated to America in the 1880s. Because I know my maternal grandfather arrived in Brooklyn at 12 years old by himself, primarily. Maybe one sister came with him. There were 12 in his family, he had 11 other siblings. And he was told to get a job in New York as a teenager. And he lived in Brooklyn, so he walked across the new Brooklyn Bridge, which was built in time for him to make those morning walks and come home at night to save the car fare, 10 cents a day. And he married in 1889 or 1901. And my father was born in 1889, so when this picture was taken, he was probably almost 29 years old or so. He was a young man. And I guess and my mom, she followed him. And they had 4 kids. He was the baby.
All right.
From 29 to 37, they raised him during the Depression. And
That must have been really tough with 4 children.
It was a very difficult part of our lives. We didn't know the difference, but it was difficult for them, and extremely difficult for my mother. Not that she was used to a lot, but she just felt so bad that her husband was walking the streets, knocking on doors, looking for work. And he never, that whole generation, which gives me fear for this generation now, today, that whole generation, a lot of them never fully recovered. Because by the time that this depression hit, he was in his mid-40s, late 40s. I know when he finally got a job in New York City from an old friend who had the wherewithal to put him on in 1933 with a wife and 3 kids at that point, to put him on for $100 a week as a salesman. My father thanked him and shook hands and said to him, I have to go down to where I sign in, right, to the company, right? And the man said, wait a minute, Eddie, my father's name, don't leave, I want to tell you something. He said, how old are you now? My father said, well, this was 33, 10, so mid-40s. He looked at him and he said, when you go down there and sign in, tell them you're 35 years old. He had to do that. Otherwise, they would say, well, what are you doing coming here looking for a job? Yeah. So he was signed on at 35, and when he retired from that company, instead of being 65, he was 75. He never said a word.
Wow.
So, you know, I know America's a great place, but it ain't easy. It ain't easy for a lot of people.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Thank you, Wayne.